Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us to learn more about social and emotional learning frameworks and comparison tools. We're looking forward to hearing from our panelists, but before we begin, I'll review just a few quick housekeeping items with you. We will be accepting questions throughout the webinar, and we'll hold a Q&A session at the end. We'll also be answering some of the questions that many of you asked when you registered for the webinar. To ask a question during the presentation, you can just type your question into the chat box in your control panel, and I'll put it into the queue to be answered during the Q&A period. If you have a question for one of our panelists specifically, please do include his or her name along with your question so that we're sure to direct it to the right person when we get to that Q&A time. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat feature to get my attention, and I'll do my best to resolve the problem for you. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides with you, so keep an eye on your email tomorrow for details on how to access those materials. We will be hearing shortly from three leaders in the field of SEL frameworks. Dr. Dale A. Blythe, a senior research consultant and advisor who recently retired as extension professor in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Minnesota, where he served as the Howland Endowed Chair in Youth Development Leadership and Senior Research Fellow with the Center for Applied Research and Educational Improvement. Dale is joined today by Dr. Stephanie Jones, who is a professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. Her research, anchored in prevention science, focuses on the effects of poverty and exposure to violence on children and youth's social, emotional, and behavioral development. Our final presenter today will be Dr. Juliette Berg, a senior researcher at American Institutes for Research, whose work focuses on understanding how to build the conditions and opportunities necessary to support the development of social, emotional, and academic competencies in children and youth. So we do have a lot to cover today. Dale, Stephanie, and Juliette will be sharing a lot of information, including a brief overview of what SEL frameworks are and their importance to effective teaching and learning. We'll also take a look at tools for comparing and connecting frameworks and SEL competencies. And we'll hear what's been learned from a large study of more than 130 SEL frameworks. So again, a lot to cover today. But we will be leaving as much time as possible for your questions. So as I said, go ahead and send those in throughout the webinar as they come up for you using that chat feature in your control panel. So before we get to Dale's portion of the presentation, we did just want to do a quick poll so that we can learn a little bit more about your use of SEL frameworks. And our first question is, how have you been using SEL frameworks? I'm going to launch the poll and give you just a minute or two to answer the question. And then we'll see how everyone has responded. So many of you may be using SEL frameworks for more than one of these purposes, so just go ahead and choose the one that you use most frequently or that's most important to you. We're getting lots of answers. We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, just 5 more seconds and we'll see what folks have said. All right, so it looks like 38% of folks are using SEL frameworks, have been using them to find and select a framework. Next, 26% are working with a framework that has been selected already. 19% are still comparing frameworks and 17% are aligning frameworks. So we've got a good number of people using frameworks in all of these different ways. So I know, Dale, you've got information to share with us about the use of SEL frameworks and as well as some of the briefs that have been available and that some of this presentation is referencing. So I will go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Emily. So as for the last 2+ years, a group called the Assessment Work Group has been facilitated by CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and that team is listed on the screen, so you can see the number of people involved, including Stephanie and myself, who are on this call. That team has produced a series of 9 or 10 briefs so far, and 10 additional ones coming out this summer around frameworks, and that's what we want to talk about today. So if we go to the next slide, some of the introductory frameworks are just talking about what frameworks are. So they're a simple tool that helps organize ideas in order to provide a foundation for thinking, communicating, and acting. So there's lots of different kinds of frameworks. Sometimes they're theoretical frame terms, sometimes they're taxonomies or models, sometimes they're simple lists of here are the important competencies one ought to be thinking about when one thinks about social emotional learning. There's the CASEL 5 is one of the more frequently used ones, but there are over 130 that we'll hear a little bit more about from Juliet. We go to the next slide. Why are frameworks important? A lot of reasons. One, because they exist and are already used as shortcuts in many places. This is where we get our language from. They influence how we interpret information. They can shift how we think about our work. They can help us get more intentional in areas that are highlighted in a framework, or ignore areas that are absent in the framework, either to the good or to the bad. They can expand and contract who's involved and how we think about it, and they can help us align multiple efforts. One of the things we found out from practitioners is that even after you select a framework, there's many issues around aligning it with different frameworks being used in different departments in the school district, or different ways of looking at things. We go to the next slide. We asked the collaborator network that's associated with measuring SEL, about 3,000 people, how they are using frameworks, and this is their responses. So you see a vast majority of using them for shaping training and professional development, 71%, designing programs, curriculum, and activities, talking with stakeholders, so some of the communication values, and then selecting and designing what to measure. So often frameworks are one of the early steps. You pick your framework, those frameworks have competencies, and then you pick those competencies you're going to work on, and those competencies lead to measures that you're going to use to assess how you're improving your work in these areas. Also lower, but still a majority of respondents said they use them for working with students, providing feedback, or talking with their families and communities. So frameworks are used in a lot of different ways. We go on, the next slide indicates that we created these 4 series of briefs I'll talk about in a minute to help practitioners at all levels better understand the role and importance of frameworks, and to try to provide tools, ideas, questions, activities that can support practitioners as they deal with the common challenges and critical tasks of frameworks. Much as we saw on the poll, the challenge of finding and selecting a framework, which 38% of you talked about, actually having a framework and how do you work it, use it, how do you compare frameworks, how do you align frameworks, are some of the things that these talk about. There are 4 series. If we go on to the next slide. There are 4 series. The introductory series contains the sort of the what are frameworks and why they're important that I've been talking about just a minute ago. There's also a brief that talks about some of the practical challenges and opportunities frameworks present. And then, as I'll talk about more in a minute, there are, the third one really talks about 10 criteria for describing and selecting frameworks. The comparative series, we have 2 of our speakers today will talk about their work in the comparing of frameworks. And then we have a third one that talks about the state SEL standards and learning standards and how those are shaping up. The other series, if we go to the next slide, are special topic series and a descriptive series. In the special topic series, it's worth noting that we have 2 briefs that are around how do we keep social emotional learning developmental? How do we keep it and understand it as kids age and develop over time? And then the third and fourth one in that series are around the important issue of equity and social emotional learning, how to be more culturally appropriate and analyze things, how to think about doing it in a more transformative way using an equity lens. So those can be helpful if those are issues you're dealing with. The descriptive series, which will be released in August, will describe 9 different commonly used frameworks, rate them on these 10 criteria I'm going to talk about in a minute, and then also give you sort of an overview of how you might use these criteria in your own work. Go to the next slide. These are the first 5. We are trying to figure out how to help people work with frameworks. We developed these 10 criteria as a subgroup, and 5 of the criteria are around the conceptual clarity. You want a framework that is conceptually clear, that has specificity around what the competencies, social emotional learning competencies are it's talking about. They're clear and they're defined. that are balanced, that they're both social and emotional, or intrapersonal and interpersonal and cognitive in nature, so that you get you don't get a sort of one competency is all you have to worry about. Social emotional learning is much more complex than that. As I noted earlier, we have a brief about, are they developmental? How do they think about age? Some frameworks are more explicit about how these competencies develop over time, others less. Similarly, on the number 4, the cultural sensitivity issue, and are they, to what extent are they empirically grounded, number 5? So what extent is the framework emerging out of a series of research studies that document the importance of these competencies? On each of these 5 frameworks, and then now the new set of 5 frameworks, we rate as low, medium, and high to give some sense of whether or not this criteria is not very well elaborated by the framework, somewhat elaborated, or highly elaborated. The second set of criteria, which are also very important, are criteria around whether there are implementation supports. So if you pick this framework, is it intended for the kind of practice you're doing? Are there resources for you as a practitioner, an adult leader? Are there resources for use with and by children and youth? So are there activity sheets and things like that that you might use with young people? Are there resources for measurement and data use? So is there a particular tool tied to a framework? And the last one is the framework empirically tested? Meaning, have people been using it, and in the process of using it, have they studied whether it's working for the ways they want it to work? We go to the next slide. These 10 criteria can be used in a lot of different ways. If you're in the process of finding or selecting a framework, you might use these criteria to prioritize what you need from a framework. So if you're in charge of professional development for your district or for the state, you might need to find frameworks that have good tools for practitioners to use in learning about them. If one of your priorities is measuring it, then you might rate that criteria highly. What we recommend is you look at the 10 criteria, prioritize them, or create a profile of which ones are important to you, and then use that in reviewing different frameworks. So that's the second way you can use them. When you're looking at a framework review to see whether it has these kind of things, you can compare different frameworks and their relative strengths and select them. These criteria are not something that you simply rate everything and add it up and take the one that scores highest. It's really rather finding a framework that matches your needs well, whether it's more on the conceptual side or more on the implementation side criteria that you want to do. These frameworks are all available online now, except the descriptive series coming out in August, and we hope you'll find them useful as you begin to deal with all the kinds of issues you are, from finding and selecting, working them, aligning them, and comparing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, that provided a really helpful foundation about SEL frameworks. And if you haven't had an opportunity to review those briefs that Dale mentioned and went over with us, be sure to visit measuringsel.casel.org/frameworks. That URL will be on a slide at the end of the presentation, and we'll also be sending it to you in the follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow. So it's a really informative set of briefs and well worth the time to go through them. So before we move on to Stephanie, who will be our next presenter, we are going to ask another poll of you, and it's a 2-part poll. The first one is, what framework are you using? And then we'll follow that up with, for what purpose are you using this framework? So I'm going to go ahead and launch part 1 of that question and see how our audience responds. And again, we know this is not a comprehensive list. We were limited to 5 choices, so listed some top options here, and know that we'll see lots in that other category as well. And we'll just give it 5 more seconds. All right, let's see what our results are. So it looks like overwhelmingly CASEL is the framework that's being used by our audience members, and then as predicted, we've got quite a few others as well. So good to know what frameworks are most in use right now. So part 2 of the question is, for what purpose are you using this framework? And again, you can only select one answer. And like with our first poll, I'm sure many of you are using frameworks for multiple purposes. So just go ahead and select the one that is most prevalent for how you're using the framework that you chose in question 1. And 5 more seconds and we'll close this poll. All right, let's see what our results are here. So half of you are using the framework to identify key skills and competencies to target, closely followed by making those curriculum development and activity decisions. And then we've got a few folks using the conduct a literature review, write a grant, or develop a funding strategy, but definitely overwhelmingly identifying key skills and competencies and informing those curriculum development and classroom activity decisions. All right, so now that we've got those poll results, we will hand things over to you, Stephanie.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited especially to get to your questions. So I will go relatively quickly. So this project I'm going to tell you about is really just sharing with you a set of tools we've developed here at the SEL Lab that are designed to help those of you working in the field think about and navigate between SEL frameworks. And so if you go to the next slide, I'll start by talking about the challenge. This picture is there to show you how confusing this can be and how many different kinds of words are used in the field to refer to social and emotional skills and competencies. And this makes it quite difficult to navigate the field and sort of understand what's important and why. And that is confusing, but it's understandable because so many disciplines contribute to what we know about this broad domain, and that's really a good thing. We definitely want that to be the case. But it gets hard to navigate between all the frameworks and the words that are employed within them. And we've designed a number of tools to help folks navigate that challenge. So we'll just go to the next slide. This is really about why all of this matters. And in our lab, in the SEL Lab, and in many other places, we really care about this cycle, about connecting what we know from research to what we design and do, the kinds of programs and interventions that we design and implement. And then, of course, that is connected to what we expect to change and how we hope to capture it with tools and assessments and measures. And that then, of course, feeds back into the knowledge base. What's critical about this is that the word itself, the word we use to define the thing that we're targeting, how we understand it from research, how we target it in programs and interventions, and then how we assess it, has to be connected, meaning we have to use the same word with the same meaning in order to ensure that these parts are connected to each other. And when there's so many different ways of talking about things out there, it gets very hard to connect these parts, and this cycle breaks down. So we either don't learn something that we had hoped to learn, or we conclude something that is not accurate given the information that we have. So getting really precise and specific and consistent and transparent in the terminology is really critical to this cycle, which is why we jumped into this frameworks world and designed the tools that I'm going to describe to you next. Next slide. Okay, so the taxonomy project is really a system. It's a website with a bunch of tools on it that's designed to help those out in the world, anybody, navigate this field. And it's really our response to this challenge of this conflicting terminology. Next animation. Okay, so our goals for the taxonomy project were really to create a system that allows users to navigate between and communicate across different disciplines and sort of ways of thinking and describing SEL. We used a coding system to look closely at all of the frameworks that are used in the field. Not all, that's an exaggeration, but the primary frameworks that are used in the field. And to determine which skills specifically are included or addressed in the framework and how they're defined, we created a huge database of our coded frameworks that then kind of sits behind and feeds into a set of interactive online tools that we view, although we're not yet quite there, we're close, we view as sort of a Rosetta Stone for the field, which means someone might be looking at the CASEL framework and see something like self-management and wonder, is that the same self-management that is defined and used in the MESH framework? Do those two words mean the same thing in those two frameworks? It turns out largely they do, but not completely. And so this taxonomy project is designed to allow users to ask that kind of question and then learn about what's the same and what's different across all these frameworks. So far, we have about 35 frameworks in our database, and they include 16 of the 16, is that right? It includes a large number of the primary frameworks that are used in the US, and now we're doing coding of a lot of international frameworks, and at the same time, we're gonna add more sort of US focused frameworks. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the coding system. This code is designed to capture whether and when and how each framework addresses a set of common non-academic skills. And we developed 3 types of codes if you go forward with the animations. And the codes are really about the broad domain, which you see here. Our coding system is designed to capture these broad areas that really reflect the boundaries of what we call the non-academic space. And that includes sort of a set of cognitive skills, a set of emotion skills, a set of interpersonal skills, kind of values, perspectives is what we refer to as personality characteristics, and then beliefs and identity and self-image. You could organize these in a bunch of different ways, but we did it this way in order to represent as closely as possible the literature, but also to include the kinds of things that are in the frameworks that dominate the field. If you do the next animation, so that's one level of code. The next level of code are the specific sort of constructs or skill areas that sit inside each of these large categories, and you can see those listed here. And then one more animation. The third category are a set of quite specific codes that then get applied to the framework. So the way this actually happens is we have coders who are trained to reliability and so on, read all of the material that is available about each framework. So they look at the domain names, the construct names, and specifically, they really look closely at the definitions that are included with any domain or construct. And that's where these codes get applied. So we do that with all the frameworks we have available to us. We build a large database, and in the end, we have a set of tools, and that's the next slide. Those tools are located on the Explore SEL website. You can look at it right now if you want to. It's exploresel.gse.harvard.edu. And the tools really, this is the beta version, everybody, just so you know. The tools really include 3 big categories of things. We have framework profiles, which allow you to look inside a framework. It has a whole bunch of descriptive information about any particular framework. We have a set of tools that allow you to compare frameworks to each other, and I'll show you some examples of that. And then finally, a thesaurus that allows a user to look for specific terms or skills and see how they are defined or how they show up in frameworks and compare them to each other. So I'll give you an example of some of these if you go to the next slide. So here's just one type of picture that would appear through the tools, and this allows you to compare sort of the focus broadly of the different frameworks to each other. So these are the big categories: the cognitive, the emotion, the social, and so on. And you can see, yes, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. You can see the CASEL one, relatively evenly distributed across those major categories, in particular the pink, the light blue, the orange, and the dark blue, with less relative focus on the purple, which is identity, and the green, which is perspectives, that's personality. So show the next one, and you can compare that to this one, which is the employability skills framework, that is very heavily focused on both the cognitive stuff, which is like persistence, perseverance, executive function, and the social stuff, which is like cooperation, reading social cues, working in a team, and that kind of stuff. So for a user who's interested in identifying a framework that meets their particular goals or is aligned with what they're trying to do, they might look at some of these frameworks against each other and say, well, we are really focused right now on the kind of cognitive domain, and so we're going to think about the frameworks that emphasize that a great deal. Another user might come along and say, we're really interested in values and character, and that's where we want to focus our work, and they might identify a framework that has a relative emphasis there. Or they might say, we really are thinking about all these things, and we'd like to use the CASEL framework because it's relatively evenly distributed across them. Okay, next slide. So this is one kind of tool. Another allows you to look at two frameworks directly. So here's just one, it has these kind of drop-down things. You can hear I'm very technologically sophisticated. It has these like drop-down things, and you can pick a framework on either side, and it will show their relationship to each other based on the coding. We created, through our coding system, a kind of similarity index that allows you to see where different terms with the same or different names are connected to others. So in this case, in the Big Five personality model, we see it against the Hilton and Pellegrino 21st Century Competencies framework, and you can see that, for example, the conscientiousness in the Big Five is related or coded as similar to the definition for work ethic in the Hilton and Pellegrino, which you might expect. You can also see, though, that extroversion in the Big Five is coded as being very similar to teamwork and leadership, which is kind of a less obvious connection, but the definitions that each of those frameworks use for those terms are actually quite similar. You can also click, if you just go one more, you can also click on them. It'll show you that highlight. You can click on them and it will show you information about a specific term, and this is kind of a peek into the thesaurus. So it lists here, it gives you conscientiousness, it shows how it's defined in the Big Five framework, and then it highlights other terms in other frameworks, not just the Hilton and Pellegrino, that were coded as somewhat similar. So now we know that conscientiousness has a related term in the framework for 21st century learning, which is manage goals and time. It has also a connection to dependability in the ACT holistic framework, and so on. So if you keep going, next slide. Okay, now this is the actual thesaurus, which you can click into, and here is the KIP framework. And if you click on any one of these particular constructs, just as you saw before, it will show you the definition for that construct. It'll show you related constructs in other, coded similarly, in other frameworks, and the size of those words is graded to how closely they align, meaning how many codes in the coding system overlapped between them. Let's see what's next. Okay, next slide. In the future, we are going to expand this platform. As I said, we're continuing to add frameworks to build the data that sits behind this whole thing. And we're doing a number of other projects where we are doing kind of an oddly similar thing with evidence-based SEL programs, sort of coding them using the same system to get really close to what they actually target and how they do that. And then in future work, we hope to apply the same thing to measures in the field, and then use this site as a platform to connect terms and words and frameworks to strategies used in programs, to measurement tools that can be used to determine effectiveness or do formative work over time, all in service of these connections between what we know, what we do, and what we understand through research and evaluation. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for that walk through this really helpful tool. And for those of you that may have missed it, I did send out by chat that URL, the exploresel.gsc.harvard.edu URL, so you can start diving into this great tool yourself.
It's in beta version. We'd love to hear any feedback about it. So that's just the qualifier there, the disclaimer, I should say.
Yes. Yeah, so get in there and start using it, and share your feedback on it.
Yep.
We'll also include that URL in the follow-up email you get tomorrow. All right, so Juliet, you are up next, and we're gonna hear from Juliet as she reviews goes over the review of the 136 SEL frameworks.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about the project that we undertook to scan the literature for different frameworks, and then provide some of the highlights that we found from that. So you can go to the next slide. So we set out to better understand and try to make sense of the landscape of social-emotional competency frameworks in order to start to identify the social-emotional competencies that are most critical to healthy development. We felt it was important to cast a wide net, examining the frameworks we often see used by educators and researchers in the field of education, and also frameworks coming out of other fields of study that often receive less exposure. We looked at a wide range of frameworks, but given other work, including the taxonomy project that Stephanie just explained, we wanted to especially focus on frameworks that might expand upon this work, including those that speak to adolescence and young adulthood, culture, trauma, special populations such as children with autism and disability, and systems of care such as foster care and juvenile justice. We especially wanted to consider the role of context in competency development. We wanted to compare and contrast the different frameworks to make connections between them, looking at how social-emotional competencies are conceptualized, operationalized, and measured across frameworks, and what competencies come up most often. So in order to make sense of the array of competencies and to align our work with the taxonomy project, we set out to apply the coding system to the frameworks that we identified. We ended up identifying more frameworks than we could have imagined. So in the end, we applied the coding system to a selected group of 50 frameworks, and I'll explain a little bit more about that coming up. So next slide. Our approach involved 5 steps. So we first conducted a scan of the literature for frameworks. We then created a database noting key information about the frameworks and the competencies within the frameworks. We compared and contrasted the frameworks, and then coded the competencies and compared and contrasted the competencies. We then searched for measures that fit within the subdomains, which is that second level that Stephanie described of competencies, to identify how and where existing measures may or may not be aligned with the competencies we identified. Next slide. So in our scan of the literature, which was our first step, as I mentioned, we looked at a wide array of areas of study, including character education, culture studies, disability, economics, education, foster care, juvenile justice and violence prevention, and so on, as you can see on the slide. We focused on childhood to early adulthood and limited our search to English language literature and frameworks developed in OECD countries. We did not look at frameworks that were specifically for early childhood. And this was because we felt like that others who are involved in this work, such as Stephanie's lab, had been covering those frameworks. We also did not look at standard-setting frameworks developed by states. Once we had our list, we sent it to experts to see if we missed any key frameworks, and then we added those additional frameworks to our database based on this feedback. Next slide. We created a set of codes to help us compare across frameworks based on information in the framework developers' readily available materials. So I do want to mention that all the information that we got, because we had such a large number of frameworks, we limited the information to what we found in the readily available materials. So there might be information that we didn't have from those materials that that is not reflected in what we have. So that's kind of a disclaimer. And we then created a database with a whole bunch of codes that you can see there. So a whole bunch of information about the frameworks. And I just want to point out a few. So we coded for whether the framework addressed cultural diversity, and the way we defined that was whether the framework addressed the unique needs and experiences of racial, ethnic, or national groups, or otherwise demonstrated sensitivity to culture in the overall framework. We also coded for whether the framework addressed experiences of adversity, trauma, and difficulty, and the way we defined that was whether the author stated that the framework was for children who have experienced trauma, complex stress, a high degree of adversity, or continued experiences with racism or oppression, or the author stated that the model was based on trauma-informed practice. So once we entered all our frameworks into this database, we then compared and contrasted. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see how many frameworks we found in each of the kind of areas of study. And this table shows that the area of education, so what's labeled as school-based competency development, produced the highest number of frameworks, not surprisingly, followed by positive youth development and workforce development. And I want to point out just a few highlights about how many frameworks directly address culture and adversity and trauma. Certain areas of study tended to produce more frameworks that spoke to these two issues. Frameworks from the field of education, workforce, and mental health had 20% to 25% of frameworks that address culture and diversity. So you can see that in that second column. And so the second column is showing you the percentage of frameworks within the area of study that addresses culture or race ethnic diversity. And then the third column, you can see the percentage of frameworks within the area of study that addressed adversity, trauma, or difficulty. And interestingly, 57% of frameworks coming out of the cultural studies and specifically addressing issues of culture address adversity and trauma, as well as 80% of frameworks coming out of the area of mental health. All three frameworks coming out of foster care and half of frameworks coming out of juvenile justice and violence prevention address trauma and adversity. And I just want to mention also that we have a full report that describes these findings, as well as a whole host of other kind of findings and highlights from our scan. And so I welcome you to go to the full report if you want more information about our findings. And we will provide you with that link. Next slide. So quickly, I want to show you that the primary reasons for the frameworks being developed were for theory building and research, so 43% of the frameworks, and then applied practice, 31% of the frameworks. Next slide. So a few highlights about what we found in our analysis of the frameworks. We found that many of the competencies overlap across frameworks. At the same time, competencies can have a different level of significance or specificity when considered in different contexts and within the specific context the framework is addressing. This context specificity signals an imperative to consider these diverse frameworks and their use for whom they were developed. This context specificity can be seen very clearly in the frameworks developed for youth-serving systems and services, such as juvenile justice and foster care. For example, pro-sociality, integration within the community, independence, and community participation come from a framework from the juvenile justice field. These competencies are not wholly different from competencies in widely used SEL frameworks, such as social competence, for example. In this context, these competencies are important for youth to gain or regain connections with others while also becoming independent members of society following an encounter with the juvenile justice system. You can click on the next animation. Frameworks that speak specifically to cultural and linguistic diversity include many of the same competencies we often see, but we can clearly see an emphasis on youth benefiting from competencies that help them to adapt, connect to community, and handle bias. All youth can benefit from these competencies, such as biculturalism, coping with racism, fairness, and respect for diversity, that help us become more aware of bias and privilege. So frameworks that do not consider culture could miss important and adaptive aspects of social-emotional development. Next animation. And as another example of the insight we gain in considering competencies in context, the adversity and trauma competencies resemble common ones such as identifying emotions, but in frameworks that specifically address adversity and trauma, the competencies provide insight into what children who have experienced trauma might need to handle a stressful environment. For children who have experienced trauma, competencies such as perspective taking and relationship building, which we see in many frameworks, become more specific to what can help children and youth mitigate the effects of trauma. And again, I just want to invite you to look at the full report if you want some more kind of insight about this, as well as specific examples. And so in the next step is when we coded the competencies. We wanted to use the Taxonomy Project's coding system for purposes of alignment. So we were interested in delineating alignment or possibilities for alignment across frameworks that have been developed in different disciplines and domains. And we didn't think that we needed two coding systems, but rather we wanted to use the existing one that Stephanie's lab created and only modify it if it was necessary. And I'll talk a little bit about how that turned out in a minute. So we coded a representative sample subset of 50 frameworks, and we coded it at the subdomain level, which was that second level that Stephanie pointed out. So what we found in coding the competencies is that there was great overlap between the domains, that first level, and subdomains, that second level, meaning that a lot of the competencies fit within more than one of these, indicating the real interconnectedness between competencies. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but can make things a bit challenging when trying to categorize competencies. But we thought this was kind of an interesting finding. And then in applying the coding system to the 50 frameworks, we found that it worked well for the expanded list of frameworks, that many of the competencies we found fit into the coding system. We also found that the coding system is flexible and expandable to fit competencies and subdomains that the original frameworks may not have included, which often were those related to equity, diversity, and older youth, adolescents, and young adults. Notably, we found a set of competencies to help youth build resilience and adapt to their environment. So this was an example of a set of competencies that might expand the subdomains of the coding system and are important because they help all youth navigate daily stresses and long-term challenges, as well as build community. And we feel like this set of competencies, which is kind of an example of competencies that we may not have kind of highlighted looking at the SEL frameworks that we often see. But they're important, but by exposing youth to resilience building competencies, adults can help youth navigate a variety of daily long-term challenges, encourage citizenship, and less judgment towards others. Other sets of competencies that we saw in our frameworks that could encompass new subdomains include resourcefulness, intimacy and attachment, and coping and resilience. And we think that these came out of having this broader set of frameworks that included addressing cultural diversity, trauma and adversity, as well as older youth. Finally, we learned through coding the competencies that although we see competencies that fall within the same domains and subdomains, the meaning these competencies take on and their urgency can be very different for different individuals and in different contexts. This is something we cannot forget when we consider what young people need to thrive and how we can help them do so. Next slide. So I'm not going to talk about our measure search, but the main highlight with our measure search was that there are a lot of measures out there that measure a lot of the competencies that we found. There is a gap in measures that measure context that are context specific and culturally specific. And the other thing we found that there is a gap in between frameworks and measures. So some of the frameworks identified measures, a lot of frameworks did not identify measures, and measures are really developed usually separate from the frameworks. And that, I think, is something that Stephanie's team is setting out to kind of address, which is great. So finally, a couple more slides. What should you think about when choosing a framework? We think, based on our scan of frameworks, that you should think about, are there clear definitions? Are there competencies that consider context? Are there the perspectives of diverse cultures, races, and ethnicities? And does the framework provide resilience-building competencies that can really provide, that really identify what all youth need, including those who face trauma and adversity and daily stresses? Next slide. And so we must remember that there's a range of experiences and needs, and that each child's social and emotional capacities and expressions of these capacities are assets, not deficits. And choosing a framework and set of competencies that's appropriate for your students and your needs is a great starting point. Beyond this, educators can do a number of things to support the social emotional development of our youth, including self-development, engaging in conversations with colleagues, identifying one's own triggers, and developing one's own competencies. And then with students, identifying expressions of competencies across contexts and cultures, reflecting on cultural biases, creating safe spaces within and outside of the classroom for young people to really develop competencies that they need based on their own experiences, providing student choice and responsibility, celebrating unique and collective identities, and really getting to know your students so you understand what they need. Social emotional competencies can benefit all young people by helping to contribute to more positive context for everyone. We as researchers, educators, families, and communities should be mindful of the complexity of social emotional development and the factors such as potentially traumatic experiences, societal marginalization, and other kinds of stressors that contribute to variability. There's not one singular approach, but multiple approaches to meet the needs of all students. And that's really what we kind of found, the conclusion we made by looking across all of these different frameworks. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet, and thanks to all of our other presenters, Dale and Stephanie, for all the information that you've provided. We definitely covered a lot in a short amount of time. So just as a reminder to folks, we will be sending out a link to the PowerPoint deck as well as to the recording. If you look in your chat, you'll see the links to the AIR report, as well as to the database that Stephanie reviewed. And we'll also include those in the follow-up email so that you can spend some more time exploring in depth. Before we get to the Q&A, I do also want to just draw your attention to the URLs that are on your screen now for the Measuring SEL website, and you can go there and find resources as well as sign up to receive emails and look at the weekly blog on this topic. And that site, measuringsel.castle.org, is also where the framework briefs are posted, and you're able to download those and explore and read them in depth as well. So take a minute to explore those when we wrap up from the webinar here. And again, we'll include those URLs in the follow-up email you get. So if you haven't been able to scribble them down now, don't worry, they'll come your way here shortly. All right, so we have about 10 minutes for questions, and we have received a lot of questions. We're going to start with just one or two that came in ahead of the webinar, and then we'll move to some of the live ones. All right, so Stephanie, Dale, and Juliet, I think our first question is really open to any and all of you, and it is, how do we choose the best fit of framework for our student population, and is it okay to adapt it to better meet their needs?
How should we do
Go ahead,
this?
Steph.
Yep, why don't you start, Stephanie, and then the others can chime in if they've got anything they'd like to add on.
Okay. Will you read it again?
Sure. How do we choose the best fit of framework for our student population? And is it okay to adapt that framework to better meet their needs?
I think that choosing a framework is an opportunity for a kind of consensus building process in your community or your setting, and demands a little sort of reconnaissance. So choosing a framework can be a way to bring folks together around a common goal, but doing it requires that you have some information about the challenges and the strengths that your student population is facing. So yes, I think one should choose a framework that is aligned with the needs that you're seeing in your setting. But that one should have a process that sits underneath that. I think that on the adapting front, I don't see a problem with looking and bringing multiple frameworks together. I do think it's important to do that with real transparency and knowledge and information about what framework designers really mean by the terms that they use. So using a site like ours, not that I'm trying to make you use our site, although we would love it if you did, to make choices about what terms and what definitions to prioritize and how to fit them together will only increase transparency, and that's really important.
I would just add that I think the thing Stephanie's talking about the sort of before you choose a framework, building the kind of consensus and using that opportunity to build understanding of what we're talking about and the degree to which it fits or doesn't fit the population working is really important. After you choose a framework, you still have the issue of how do you help people understand that framework and communicate with it, and that includes sometimes translating it. So going to different population groups, cultural groups in your community and talking about this is what we're talking about. How would you talk about that in your culture? How would it be different in your culture? What would it look like in your culture so that you you ground it in different cultures in important ways? That begins to help align it. In the adapting frameworks issue, owning the framework, if you're going to work it and really, make it drive your social emotional learning instruction and your curriculum choices and all that, adapting can be helpful because it can increase ownership. The terms feel more like yours rather than some researchers. But when you adapt, you also can be moving away from easy access to tools that either for implementation or for measurement. So the more you adapt, the more you have to be able to invest in filling those potential holes that might be filled by existing frameworks already. So it's a trade-off you have to balance.
I agree with all that, and I think also it's not always, you may need multiple frameworks. You may need you may need a kind of a general framework for tier 1, for example, and then you may need some students may need another type of framework. So there's also the question of, maybe one framework is not enough, and maybe you have a few different frameworks that work for your student population. And so I think that's really the most important thing is kind of understanding what your student population, understanding the student population and what their needs are.
And Juliet, that actually segues really nicely into the next question, which is how do we incorporate pieces of various frameworks together into one streamlined system, SEL, PBIS, restorative practices, MTSS. So I don't know if you want to elaborate any further on the point you just made.
Dale and Stephanie, do you have anything to add about that?
I think that integrating SEL work into a framework of PBIS or MTSSB is completely doable. I think that the way we think about MTSSB PBIS work is that it really provides a structure within which one can embed the instructional practices and the kind of work that is really specific to SEL. I wouldn't say that those two things are the same thing, but just in the way that a framework can guide the instructional work of SEL, that framework can be employed inside of the broader structure of PBIS or MTSSB to integrate the SEL work into that structure by giving that work focus in a particular area, focus on particular skills and competencies. So I don't really see that you would have to adapt an SEL framework in order to do that kind of integrative work. I just would be cautious about thinking about the two kinds of things as the same thing, because they're not.
Okay, that's helpful clarification.
Just to add to the discussion, that being able to align across frameworks is very important. When we had a national group of practitioners come together, it was the alignment issue was more often the struggle than the selection issue was. So depending on your district or your setting, if you have a framework you're using to drive your work, and that language that you're using, whether it's the CASEL or some other language, the more there's a sort of single framework that is trying to drive the way you communicate and think about and implement your work, the more important that using that framework consistently is going to be, and the more important a specific crosswalking of what that framework means for another framework, whether it's another SEL framework or another behavioral framework like PBIS or something. So a lot of people are now creating these sort of crosswalking tools where if you see it, when we talk about self-management, it's the same in PBIS, that's this or whatever. So getting that kind of explicit, and you often find in Minneapolis, when they were doing this, they found every department, in other words, student support services or psych department, the school psych department, had different frameworks they were using, and it was important to be able to decide how much you were going to use a common language and then how much you were going to translate that common language into more specific pieces that connect to already existing frameworks that are in use and that you're not going to get rid of, but you may need to incorporate or integrate. So it has to be a proactive process. And part of the decision has to be about the extent to which that if you have a driving framework, how much is that driving framework, in fact, in the district or the organization's strategic plan? How much is it really a driving framework or just one of many that you have to work with? Because that helps you decide how you work on the alignment incorporation stuff.
Great, thank you, Dale. That was a helpful expansion on that. And we are getting close to our time, but I'm gonna go ahead and get one more question in there. And Stephanie, this came in during your presentation of the database and the tools. Since SEL is an experiential instrument, how are you able to assess all of these things without being present for the lesson? And are these assessments solely based on the written content of an SEL provider's website?
Can you read that again? I'll just...
Sure. Yep, it's long.
Yep.
Since SEL is an experiential instrument, how are you able to assess all these things without being present for the lesson? And are these assessments solely based on the written content of an SEL provider's website?
So just to be clear about the taxonomy project, a little of the how-to, we gathered information from framework developers, which is sometimes the same as, but not always the same as, SEL program developers and providers. These are the folks who come up with the organizing system that says, these are the skills and competencies that are important, and this is how they're defined. We gathered that information, and then we coded it. So we didn't, in this particular project, engage with program development or provider information. We really just focused on the frameworks. And we did it using the written materials that are available from those developers or are available online. I do think that when one is thinking about measurement and assessment in the world of SEL, one has to take great care to not get too far away from exactly what you describe in your question, which is the experiential component of SEL. And in the world of measurement and assessment, sometimes we get a little too far away from the real context where SEL is happening or where key interactions are happening that we need to be able to see and understand in order to get a sense of what's happening. So if I were to take your question and extend it into the world of measurement and assessment, I would say, yeah, we really need to be careful that we're not missing key and rich context-based interactions that are really the essence of SEL. And so for all of us who are moving into the world of measures and assessment, we shouldn't forget that. It's key.
I can just add it briefly. The issue that's raised in the question is very much the issue that Stephanie pointed out in her diagram of connecting the way you think about it, the way you try to do it, and the way you measure it, and make sure those things are in sync in some fundamental way. Otherwise, you could end up doing great work, but assessing it on totally different criteria, deciding you're not having any effect when in fact you are. You're just not measuring the things you're doing. So getting those things aligned, I think, is important. The other thing I would say is that if you're interested in the assessment side, the Measuring SEL site that's up also has an assessment guide tool that helps you find instruments that measure different of these competencies, and also refers to a guide about how to think about assessment in different ways. So you start working backwards from assessment to the competencies. And RAND also has a education assessment finder that's very helpful. All those are referenced on the website. And just one last point on the previous question about incorporating things into PBIS and stuff. There is a blog on our website specifically about that by Clayton Cook that might be worth looking at for people.
Thank you, Dale. That was a lot of great additional information for people to explore. And I do wish we had time to take more of the questions that came in before the webinar and during the webinar, but we have reached the end of our time together. So thank you again, Dale and Stephanie and Juliet, for joining us today and sharing all this information and expertise with us. And thanks to everyone in the audience who took the time to join us. As a reminder, keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow for a link to that presentation deck and for the recording, as well as to some of the URLs in particular that Stephanie and Juliet shared. I also would like to invite you to mark your calendar for July 18th. That is the date of our next Frameworks webinar. And we'll be looking at the two other categories of briefs that Dale mentioned. So this will be another great information-rich program. And there will be a link to register for that July 18th webinar in the email that you get tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.